All right, Ben, let's get to our instant replay of the week, where I'm not positive we actually could watch an instant replay of the Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson fight on Netflix last Friday night. Very, very hotly anticipated, pushed back, millions and tens of millions of dollars at stake, and we can get to the broadcast as much as we were able to parse it and some of the ramifications that could be upcoming for Netflix. But as I was kind of watching the reactions across, First Take and Dan Patrick and Colin Cowherd and everybody sort of chiming in here, maybe it's just because it was, 3 days ago by the time anyone had a chance to weigh in on Monday. Maybe it was just, let's cut to the chase. But the disastrous technical side of this, I actually think is getting completely blown past. Like, this just didn't work. We couldn't watch it. And this is a company not only that has a lot of sports rights coming, but that we've been hailing as the future for a friggin' decade at this point. And this was their one shining moment, and they absolutely dropped the ball. And it feels like everybody just sort of wanted to talk about Tyson being old or his ass or Jake Paul being goofy or whatever we wanted to do. This was humiliating for Netflix. This was atrocious. I couldn't even sit there and get through it. I probably would have turned it off if I didn't know we were going to be talking about it here today.
Yeah, I was tasked with reviewing the whole ordeal, and my assignment was to review the commentary, the presentation, like how Netflix sports looks as a live event. And my review just wound up being about the technical difficulties because it was such a barrier for entry that I couldn't clear, that it felt disingenuous to sit there and complain about Mario Ronaldo's forced pop culture references, or him and Roy Jones Jr. continually bickering about why Mike Tyson was biting his glove. Like, this was the story to come out of this event, was you couldn't watch it. It was not a watchable product. I mean, by the end, you pretty much had like a meth streams quality version of the main event up on the screen, and you could kind of see what was going on. But at least from everyone I talked to, everyone I saw on social media, and in my own anecdotal experience, like, this was like, all right, you're watching it, it's going to buffer, it's going to crap out around 25%, and you're going to have to restart it every 5 minutes or close to it. And that, I think you're right. That's the story of all this. And it's so fascinating because this isn't ESPN Plus. This isn't Peacock. This isn't CBS Sports's Paramount app. This is Netflix. Like, you're right. This is supposed to be the giant. And for all of this praise that's been heaped on Netflix and the crowning of them as the king of streaming, they seem to be the only one that hasn't figured out live streaming while all of the competitors do. And with this NFL, the Christmas Day doubleheader coming up, like, this is going to be a big, big deal.
Yeah, I thought that actually some of the elements of the broadcast, yes, it was a circus. Yes, it was very contrived. I mean, we knew that going in. I don't think we needed until Friday night to know that an age disparity that is more than double was going to be a little bit goofy, and that the fight itself might fall short of any sort of epic legendary thing we're going to be telling our kids about. But that all set aside, like, I thought the little pre-produced segment that they did showing Tyson's history and career was, for somebody like me that has seen most but not all of it, and it was a helpful recap, not to mention people significantly younger than me. Like, my cousin was watching with my parents and they were texting me. He had basically no idea who Mike Tyson was. Like, some of those things were, I thought, very well done. I thought that the flow of who they were going to, whether it was the panel with Kate Abdo or the, ringside before the match of Moro and Rosie Perez and Roy Jones, then some of the interviews with, the celebrities that were there, cut to the, dressing room. I thought it was actually, it moved. It's a long night. And I thought from, the Serrano-Taylor fight through the end, I thought that element of it worked for me. Just the vibe of it, kind of the pacing, everything else. Whoever's in the truck was doing a good job, I guess. But what did you think of the talent here? I mean, if you agree or disagree on the energy of it, I think that could be good too. But the talent, I think, got a lot of attention here.
Yeah. Well, real quick, I actually think that's what made this such an interesting test for Netflix, because let's say someone your age is watching it with your dad doesn't really know who Jake Paul is. And I mean, you have an idea who Mike Tyson is, but you don't know about everything necessarily that it was like growing up with Mike Tyson in his prime. And so this was like a really interesting contrast of how do you tell this story when most of your audience is really only going to be familiar with the full story of one of the fighters. And I thought Netflix passed it. And so I think if you want to spin this positively for Netflix, I think they really only need to figure out the technical side. Like, I think they could make improvements to the production side and in terms of the talent. Like, Mauro Ranallo is not my favorite, and I'm familiar with him from pro wrestling, and he wasn't my favorite there. I'm not into that over the top, enthusiastic Gus Johnson type of broadcasting. And so, like, if we want to talk about the talent, and I didn't think Roy Jones Jr. was great. I did like Rosie Perez in the booth, though. I thought that was a nice addition and a nice contrast to the booth. But like, they could make improvements there, and you would suspect that they will. But I do think if you want to spin this as a positive for Netflix, like, if they can just get past that major hurdle of allowing people to watch their product, like, I think they have a pretty good product, besides, the entire event being a de facto freak show.
Yeah, the Cedric the Entertainer part of it, I think, was the weakest point. He didn't really. There's always that awkward thing when you bring a celebrity in and you end up kind of being able to tell they didn't super want to be there. It's like, obviously I'm sure he could provide commentary on the circus side of it. He said in the moment he's been around tons of Tyson fights and everything else. Like, okay, but he was there for the check is sort of what it felt like. No shade towards Cedric, but that part was a weak point, and people had a lot of criticism for that panel overall. I thought Ariel Helwani did a great job. I think that he tied together the biting of the ear nonsense, or the biting of the glove nonsense, to let Tyson land the joke of, I have like an oral fixation or whatever, which kind of harkened back to the Holyfield fight and everything. And, he did a great job at the weigh-ins, milking that slap and the toe stepping and all the kind of fallout there. So I think shout out to him. I'm never fully sure with a situation like this. I'm sure Netflix had a say in who the talent was, but it's probably not solely up to them because they're working with Most Valuable Promotions. And I mean, I think Jake Paul probably has a large hand in a lot of this with his kind of contrived fights. So I don't know how hard to come down on Netflix on that side of it.
It was a lot of the guys who were involved with the previous Jake Paul fights. And so that's Ariel was involved. I know they had a fight in Cleveland that I covered a couple of years ago, and Ariel was heavily involved in that. I believe Mauro has called a couple of them, or at the very least, there's that link with Showtime Boxing that has done some of Jake Paul's fights previously. So, yeah, I mean, I kind of get the sense that's how Netflix is going to handle this. Like, it seems like they're kind of leaving it up, at least in terms of the NFL games coming up. Like, they're really putting it with WWE. I mean, WWE does all of its production in-house. It's basically a product that's ready to lease. And so that seems to be the model that Netflix is going for. And yeah, I would anticipate, I don't know like how many Netflix exclusive broadcasters we're going to see. It seems like something where it's going to be dependent on what the production is, and they'll work hand in hand with whatever the entity is that's doing it.
Probably why people have long kind of connected them to UFC as well when those rights come up, because it's also a little bit plug and play. It feels like that's probably partly what you can blame for the technical difficulties. I doubt that this is a whole Netflix team that is trying to do this. I don't know if it's a server problem. I don't know if it is a, quality problem where they're like, my parents, for instance, this is the most not legitimate reporting I can possibly do on this, Ben, but my parents had no issues because they watched it on one of the iPads in the house that was like several years old. So tiny screen, old technology. It didn't buffer or lag for them at all once they switched from the TV to that, is what I heard. And it felt like I was seeing some of that online. but I was watching it on a pretty old Apple TV and a pretty old TV screen, and that didn't really help me at all. So, I mean, you and I aren't production whizzes, but I don't know why this is so hard for them compared to those other companies you've talked about. Peacock's done an NFL game, all these things. Why can't Netflix do it?
Peacock does WWE pay-per-views or PLEs once a month. Like they do WrestleMania, and I watch most of them. I can't remember any major issues with any of those. Paramount does Champions League games on a fairly regular basis. I mean, there is a lot of live programming on these streaming apps. And so the fact that Netflix is the one, you said you weren't sure if it was a Netflix issue. It's hard to give them the benefit of the doubt because that Love is Blind finale or reunion show was such a disaster. Like that kind of set the gold standard for this. And so the fact that they weren't prepared for this, whatever it was, whether it was server or some other technical difficulties, that to me raises a lot of red flags. And again, like we have an NFL doubleheader coming up here on Christmas Day. It's going to be watched by probably more than 60 million people. We think at this point, like this is a massive test. And if they don't pass it, like, I think there's real questions about where they fit in to the hierarchy when it comes to the streaming wars.
Well, so you mentioned the Love is Blind catastrophe, which was their first big live event ever, only about a year and a half ago, but they've done several since, and that one crashed and burned. It pretty much didn't ever go live as far as what I can remember, and what digging back through it, they ended up, some people were maybe getting through, and then they ended up just uploading a final version of it and kind of posting it on the app at that point, and they had to like issue an apology or kind of a letter to their investors, and it really, really went sideways for them. And I went back and looked at the quote from the earnings call after that, which co-CEO Greg Peters said the issues at that point in time were due to a bug that we introduced when we implemented some changes to try and improve live streaming performance after the Chris Rock special, which was a little bit lower production quality. It's a comedy special. You just point a camera at a guy, you have 4 angles, and you go for it. And so they were trying to, get better from there. And he said, we just didn't see this bug in internal testing because it only became apparent once we put multiple systems interacting with each other under the load of millions of people trying to watch Love is Blind. We hate it when these things happen, but we'll learn from it and get better. Clearly not. They're not going to figure it out and get better. And this just continues to be a problem for them. And I kind of had it, Ben, as the first real failure of the streaming sports era. Like it's kind of impressive we didn't have one of these sooner. If you think about it, like how much pressure there was on Prime Video, for instance, with the first Thursday night football game, which was probably kind of patient zero in all of this. I mentioned the NFL wildcard game on Peacock, which was earlier this year. I threw in Gold Zone on Peacock with just so many different games going on and the cutting and all that, but really just all the exclusive live stuff that was on Peacock for the Olympics this past year in Paris. And then one that I don't think people necessarily pay a lot of attention to, but that is another platform managing this. You mentioned Paramount Plus. I think that could be in here too. But Disney Plus routinely streamed, I think they lost some of the rights last year, but they've had cricket rights in India and Cricket World Cup. And if you look at the numbers for that stuff, it's on par with this event, which Netflix said 60 million people watched. And we never hear about issues of all these Indian cricket fans getting angry at Disney Plus. Everybody can do it. Netflix just dropped the ball. And I know we keep harping on it, but they have a lot at stake here. They're the next thing. And this could not have happened at a worse time.
Even listening to that explanation you just read, like it's kind of cringy. It's like you're not some mom and pop shop. Like you're Netflix. Like it bugs and internal testing and all that. Like it doesn't matter. Like figure it out. You're putting on this super high profile event. People need to be able to watch it. People pay for it, even though they're not paying a $60 fee. They're paying a $15 or a $8 fee, whatever it is. And
I was going to say, meanwhile, you're raising prices like every year. You know, no one's going to have sympathy.
I do wonder though, because you mentioned we've both mentioned like all these other entities that do it on a regular basis. This feels like something where Netflix just needs to do it on a regular basis. And we do have the WWE deal coming up here at the start of 2025. So they're going to be doing a live 2 to 3 hour show on a weekly basis here starting in January.
Yeah, in
And
2
to me,
months.
right, like that's one, they're going to have to figure it out. And then two, at the very least, like that should give them at least some trial and error in terms of how they handle it in the future with big events like this, with more NFL games. If they do get UFC, like I do think just getting in the flow of doing it as opposed to having one big quarterly event like they've seemingly been doing, I think that's probably going to help. And I do wonder if this podcast will just go in some sort of time capsule where it's like, remember that time like Netflix couldn't even stream the Jake Paul versus Mike Tyson fight because
But
they're going
wouldn't
to
we have said that after the Love is Blind thing?
Right. Well, that's what made this so baffling. And that's why you can't, this isn't just some one-off, right? This isn't us overreacting. This is like, hey, Netflix very clearly has a live streaming issue and they're going to have to figure it out if they're going to be a major player. And we already know they are going to be a major player because they have the rights to Monday Night Raw in 6 weeks.
Yeah, I mean, and I think we would have assumed that this Christmas Day thing was the bridge to more purchasing of NFL rights, whether that's, can we get an international game? Can we keep doing Christmas every year? And then eventually when the rights come up in I think 27 or 28, I think all of us were kind of thinking, yeah, Netflix will make a pretty substantial bid there. I mean, I would hope we're not talking about this in 2028 anymore, but I guess that just brings me to this. So 60 million people estimated, although they released something else this morning, Ben, that it was like, well, 100 million people plus actually watched at least 1 second. I mean, we'll never know because these numbers are obscured on purpose, but let's just say 60 million. You had Jake Paul bragging that they broke the app as people are screaming about not being able to watch the thing.